am like a little technologically challenged this morning with don't have a mouse and all sorts of things that aren't working. But I'm super excited to be here today. I took over the RecOps or launched the RecOps peer mastermind group. I can't remember when we launched it a few months back, and we had talked about wanting to get some speakers on our panel and have speakers join us. And so not only do we have one, we have two amazing RecOps leaders that are going to be joining. So I will just do a brief intro. Brandon has been a TA professional for over 16 years, and he founded Noble Talent. It's a full service talent strategy and operations consulting firm that helps early to mid-stage companies scale their recruiting functions. And then Jeremy Lyons is, the expert in all things RecOps. He's the co-founder of the RecOps Collective, and he makes recruiting operations accessible to companies of all sizes and industries. He actually, if you don't subscribe to it, he has a great newsletter that he sends out and is like so many great tools, a chat GPT, a recruiting ops specific GPT, and all sorts of amazing things. So I am super excited myself to hear from them both today. And so the format of today's session is we do want to make it interactive. I did put a survey out in the community to see if anyone had any questions that they wanted. I didn't get anything, so you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. But since we have a pretty small group here, I would love it to be interactive, but I know we do have some questions that we can have them talk through as well, but we really want to make this valuable to everyone that's here. But with that, before we get started, I would just love, Jeremy and Brandon to do their own intros and maybe just talk a little bit about, how they got to, start their careers, like what from their professional journey kind of led them to specialize in the recruiting operations function. And we'll just start from there.
You want to go alphabetically, Brandon, and you can go first?
Sure, thank you. I can give you my quick synopsis on my journey. So like probably most of us that are in TA fell into TA. It aligned with my personality, loved it. So I was really lucky. I got to start off at Netflix. Was there for a few years, and this was like DVD shipping days. So I was like working on staffing the fulfillment centers with like leaders, drivers, techs, like all that kind of stuff. So it was an interesting start to my career. And then switched over to headquarters, like engineering and marketing and pretty much anything under the sun there. And then got to go to Facebook and did a lot of recruiting for recruiting and built it. Like at the time, I was the only person doing that. Now there's like teams, or at least there were teams doing that. And then it was from there, went to Tesla after a couple of years of doing like sales recruiting there, led the team for sales and delivery recruiting, like hiring 1,000 people a year. And then moved into like much smaller startup world at Enjoy Technology, where I became the head of talent there. And that's where I really got the taste for recruiting operations, because we adopted Greenhouse, which was incredibly messy. Everybody had admin privileges. We couldn't report on anything at all. And that became like the night job, the weekend job to like clean things up. And from there went on to Gong, which is like sales enablement software. So, and then for the last 3 years, I've just been focusing on recruiting operations as a function. And basically what we do is either if there isn't support within an organization, for RecOps, or they need interim head of TA, but we try to just stay like within ops. And usually companies wait too long before they focus on operations, or they have like a coordinator do it, or the TA leader's trying to do it, but they don't have the time, right? That was my experience. So now I'm focusing on that as like a fractional support. And so I have one colleague that helps with that. So I just saw it as such a need. I had a knack for it, loved systems, loved technology, loved process and data, right? So it all made sense, but there were a lot of things about being a TA leader and a recruiter that just don't enable you to actually focus on those things. So now that's all we do. I see a lot of nodding heads, which is great. But that's how I got into it and why I do what we do. And, I met Jeremy through that because he is the voice and the support of the RecOps community, and he's been an amazing partner. Over to you.
Well, thank you for that intro. I will say this. I don't know how I managed to become the voice of the space or talk or do it. I think I just happened to be the person who kept talking about it the most, and wanted people to understand that it is fundamentally different than what you do in recruiting. How you think about recruiting operations, how you do recruiting operations is actually you could take that skill, you could go anywhere with it. And it's really about learning the language of people, learning the language of business. And we'll dive into that more later in the conversation. Unlike Brandon, I hate when I hear people say that they fell into recruiting. I feel like it sets the minute somebody says that, and this is no assault on Brandon, the minute it sets some people say that, I feel that other people outside of our space hear that and make it think that, oh, well, recruiting is so easy, everybody can do it. And the thing that I tell people is recruiting is really easy, ... to get wrong. And so you have to finish the statement. But again, my name is Jeremy Lyons. I discovered recruiting at birth. My mother was an executive recruiter. So if you were ever a kid and wondered what it would be like to have your parents look at your resume, I will tell you that starts a lot more arguments, or it started a lot more arguments when I was a kid growing up than it actually helped. Because, you know, moms are great. And I'm very happy that I have a lot of strong female role models in my family. But asking my mother to look at my resume was like, please put on your professional hat and then give me feedback. Don't put on, and then you're expecting sort of a mom response. But anyway, that aside, I've been in the recruiting operations game for about 8 years now. I started RecOps Collective at the end of 2022. As I was being fired from a company, and on the way out, they said, look, you got us ahead of our hiring goal, namely because you built the system so well that it streamlined everything. And I also got into the recruiting operations space at a very interesting time when RecOps was starting to become a thing. And I really fell in love with the back end systems because for me personally in my career, and this was only something I've kind of discovered in the last couple of years, is I like systems because systems have rules. You know where the sandbox is, you know where the edge of that sandbox is going to be. And so now you just have to design everything within that sandbox. And I liked solving those problems. I liked working with the people. I liked staying connected with the people. And that is kind of how I find myself where I am today. And for those, Brandon's worked with a number of really, really great companies, learned a lot from those people. My career has actually been on the other side of that. I've worked for companies as maybe they're going through really big change. I have one of the last AOL offer letters ever out. We worked during the We Crashed era. I got a recruiting operations manager job by Wish. So, it's one of those things where a lot of the things that I've learned, a lot of the things that I'm able to bring in terms of my conversations are, okay, this is what I've seen not go right. Here's how we're going to make it go right.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. And I love, Brandon's story of I fell into it, by chance. And Jeremy, you started yours while you were in your mother's womb, probably to, develop you into that person. And, we all kind of find ourselves in these different roles. So my guess, and, we may not have time to do like introductions of everyone on the team, but as people have questions, they can ask and share their own roles and kind of where they're working. But, there's a lot of people that fall into, a recruiting leader role, and, RecOps is a part of it. And there's people that, have an official RecOps title, and myself even included, right? Like everyone has a different idea of like, what is RecOps and what does that mean? So could you share maybe your definition of RecOps and maybe clarify any common misconceptions about what it is and what it's not, right? Because there's often different terminology. So just so that we're all, clear, could you share some of that?
I suppose I'll just in terms of ping pong, I'll take it first. But before I want to clarify, because I know I said probably a lot of us did fall into it. But I look at that and I'm like, it's easy to get into, really hard to get it right. Also very rare, as I'm sure all of us know. We've worked with a lot of recruiters, and as the industry has billowed, like during boom times, it's just like everyone just jump in, right? And there's a lot of inconsistency, people not knowing what they're doing. So, but there's no school, like for it. There's no I mean, there are certifications and trainings and things like that, but there's no mandatory, like you have to have this degree to become a recruiter. So I think that's where like TA and HR kind of get a bad rap. So I fully agree with what Jeremy said, but I also want to qualify what I said.
Put you on fire there, either Brandon.
Yeah. So what I consider talent operations, like in like what we do as a business, I mean, you could think about it as everything that's not actual recruiting, but it's the process optimization, like getting everything from like the time we, like meet a candidate to the time we hire and onboard them. It's like defining what happens so that we're all march into the same beat of the drum, that things are documented well, that we can scale as another recruiter comes on board. It's not just tribal knowledge, right? That we're like, oh, sit with this person and figure it out, and like do things the way that they do it. It's like actually putting some rigor around it. So it's maturing your hiring practices. And then other things like tech stack, your ATS is your foundational system, but there might be other things that you're integrating in that. So like technology as a whole. Also knowing how you're doing, right? So like analytics, being able to pull up reports and make sense of it. And then there's a training element to a lot of this as well. So enabling your people, that are interviewing, enabling your recruiters, enabling hiring managers, that they're all on the same team. Like that's what I think about as recruiting, is like it's a team sport. If it's just the recruiter being either praised or blamed, like that's a farce, right? It really takes everybody working together to hire well. And then another element of it is employer brand and programs, things like that. So that's like, let's say the 5 tenets that we stick to, but I know Jeremy has a little bit broader or different definition. So I'd love to hear your input on it.
Well, actually, I mean, that's everything that Brandon says. There is what I believe too. I think the way that I usually like to explain to people that kind of helps people sort of think about where it sits is that there are essentially 4 main columns or 4 main tenets of recruiting operations. 5 if you consider this sort of +1 category, which I'll say. But you generally have your operations pillar, which is everything that is very like that tactical things that you're hitting. So your process improvements, your tooling, maybe your recruiting coordination team, if that's going to roll into an ops function. You've got your data and analytics. That's pretty straightforward. Programs and initiatives. Now, programs and initiatives, and this is where like the language of recruiting has not been standardized, and it's important, is something to be talked about. And so when I think of programs and initiatives, I'm thinking of your referral program, your internal mobility program, your maybe it's your early careers program. It's that programmatic and initiative elements that you're doing and you're building on strategy. Now, when people are thinking about recruiting operations, people tend to separate strategy and operations. I tend to think of, well, operations will inform strategy. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything you're doing is tactical, but you have to know where your constraints are operationally before you can kind of start to strategically place things on the board. And then that +1 category that people consider may or may not be employer branding. If your employer branding sits within your recruiting team, generally speaking, you're going to have that sit within your operations function. You might pull people in from the team who maybe want stretch assignments. But if that sits within your marketing team, your recruiting operations person will generally like partner with those recruiting with that side of the fence too. So that's why it's sort of kind of a plus minus. The big thing that I also tell people too is you can be specific to some of these pillars. Very rarely are you going to see any recruiting operations professional be phenomenal at all of these pillars. And that's, I think, something that really is something that gives RecOps a warm hug kind of thing, is that we are able to take people in, take the skills that they're bringing. Maybe they want to change over from another side. Maybe they're like, hey, I'm a data analyst and I don't get to talk to people and I'm more of a people person and I want to be able to use these skills that I have. They can be over, you can move them, you can use them in recruiting operations. So it's, if you note in kind of everything they said there, it's not really so much about like having those people do the recruiting, but in some cases it is actually, I think, pretty useful to have a RecOps person or be in a RecOps role where maybe you carry one rec. And the reason for doing that is if you're carrying that one, serves as a really great testing ground for everything else that you're doing. And so it helps you understand every change that you're going to make. And that is something that I think is really important, because you can bring stuff to the conversation in that way.
I also would love to add, Jeremy, I love that you mentioned that, because I've talked to RecOps people who have never done recruiting, never carried a rec, and literally rolling his eyes when he's talking about the recruiters and how like awful they are, because they like, he just did not understand what it is to recruit, right? And so like, I think it also gives a RecOps person a lot of empathy about what the recruiter's going through and how much they're juggling, and know exactly what they're implementing, right? So thank you for mentioning that.
No, of course. And I think to build on that, one of the things that's really important on any conversation within your recruiting operations side, recruiting operations thinking, to not to totally change subjects, and we can go back to the main questions we have here, is I think that when you're thinking about recruiting, you have to think about whether or not you're trying to solve in any sort of thing. Are you trying to solve for a people problem, which could be a software thing, or a hardware thing, which is like a tool or something that's just not working that you have to rip and replace. But I think also one of the things that's really important in the conversation, you don't actually have to have had recruited, but I do think that it's important because, or it can be important because maybe you're going to be designing something and you're going to move a button from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. In recruiting operations, I'm going to be like, all right, cool. You know what? Look, like, move the button, fine, no big deal. But if you're, as a recruiter, every single time you're going to find the button and it's now moved, that's extra time. And in RecOps, most of your measurements are time effectiveness things. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, is that anytime you make a change. And I do also think that on the recruiting operations side as well, it can sometimes be really helpful to have conversations with recruiters where you have to understand that, like, you can do everything right and still not hire this person. And that is something that I think that can also be really hard sometimes the first time in a RecOps role, where you're like, wait, we designed the perfect process. Like, everything should be going fast. This is the right person for the role. What happened? And that's when I also like to tell people, it's like, in recruiting operations, 9 times out of 10, you're dealing with the most combustible element on the planet, and that is human emotion.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I did put in the chat, I did ask a request for the team to understand how many people are in like a true like TA leader role, recruiting role, or recruiting ops. And it looks like we've got a big, mix of both, right? So if someone's in like a TA leader role, they own kind of that ops function too. And then there are people here that truly are in like a RecOps role specifically. So, as we think about, I just this week stepped into a new role as a TA leader for an organization. And, as I'm looking, it's a small team. That's myself and 2 recruiters. There's a ton of opportunity to do process work, system work, employment branding. There's like a ton, which I get super excited about, because like, that's the stuff that I love. Again, I will still own some of the executive level recs and things, as well. But, when you think about the different sides of people that start in TA or start as a recruiter and then move into a RecOps function, like, what are some early indicators that a company is like ready to build out a dedicated either RecOps function or team, as you think about that, as many like on the on the call are probably like growing into those other roles. Like, how do you know that someone's ready to like have a specific function for RecOps?
I'd say biggest indicator, or at least the early indicator, is, well, first off, you're hiring, and likely you have more than one recruiter. But I think it's more than anything when you're moving from just reactive recruiting to getting a bit more sophisticated with your hiring engine. That's when you want to consider bringing in RecOps as a function. Thinking about like the consistency factor, right? Like Jeremy was mentioning, is like, we've got everything right, but like, we're still not hitting it. Like, you might have built the process, but is it being followed? Right. And like seeing if it is, right. And then how can we get everybody on board? So it's a consistency piece and just predictability to your hiring, that, if we open this job, it's going to take relatively similarly, like about 30 days or 60 days for this type of position. And you can at least call the shots when somebody from the business that isn't in recruiting is asking, that you can let them know, like, this is how long it's going to take. These are the challenges. If they're just like pushing you to do things in a certain way, you're like, I'm going to assert that, like, I've got the experience here. And, because a lot of, like, let's say founders will just jump to like, you need to do this, you need to do that. And they're just like dictating how to recruit, even though we know it's probably the worst possible way to do it. Right. But it's like being able to, when you get data, bring data to prove the point, right? It's like, how can you tell the story that's going to convince them that we should try it an alternate way, right? So things like that. But I'd say if things aren't running smoothly, they're not consistent, like, that's when you need RecOps. And I think about like our business as like, we're paving the road ahead of the recruiters so that it's not this bumpy, rocky road, that when they're recruiting, that it's just super smooth. Like, they like take out as many of the barriers as possible, the speed bumps, all those things. And that's like what we do initially, is like interview the recruiting team, interview the hiring managers, like see what's going well, but also the like silent things that people don't want to talk about, that like the hiring manager is like angry about this, or like the recruiters are angry at the hiring managers for this, or the system's just a complete mess and it takes forever to do anything. Those types of things. It was like, cool, we heard you, but like, who's got time to jump in the system and fix it? Or who's got time to mend the relationships? Or who's got time to like diagnose your pipeline and see what's going on, right? So those types of things.
Yeah, and my mindset, at least building off of Brandon's, is this: like, you can bring in a RecOps person at any time. Because one of the things that I say about recruiting operations is it is a skill set, but it is also a mindset. And so you could realistically, if a company is at 10 people, you could bring in a recruiting operations person. It's just the function and the goals of the recruiting operations person are going to be a little bit different, depending on the founders, depending on what they founded and how they did it. When I was brought in as employee 10 at a company, I was brought in because they had already done hiring in one specific kind of way, and they were just looking for new ideas. So it was about, to Brandon's point, building a road that made that repeatable over and over and over and over again, so that you could go and do things. But I've also come into companies where there have been 75 people, and what they've recognized is like, hey, we've been hiring, and the hiring has been fine, and we've gotten quality people, but really what we need to now do is to kind of legitimize ourselves. We need this role. For lack of a better word, I think we all know recruiting is very much a copycat business. You see one group do it, everybody sees it, they want to do it, and all of that. I think what becomes really important when you're bringing in the recruiting operations person, if it's at a later stage or even at the beginning when they're there, it's an operational role. You're there to make things more efficient, but you're not there to be a magician. Yes, you can work some magic, but if you need to play hero ball every single time to get something done, that's more indicative of other conversations that need to be happening within the company in order to be able to get the company past a certain point. And RecOps at specific levels is going to be doing very different things. It may even niche down. I think one of the things that I see when I look at the market and I look at the tech and I look at how the tech is being talked about and certain things that are going on, it creates a very interesting future for when RecOps will come in versus old models as well.
So if you think about thinking about how you kind of started up, for those that are like in a function, do you have any tips or tricks or thoughts for people of like how they can build out a RecOps function within an existing team? Like, we're all in this landscape right now where many of us are being asked to do more with less or keep the resources we have. So do you have any tips for, hey, you might not be in a position where you're ready to hire, you know, a RecOps person and create a rec or create a whole new function or department, but how do you build out that structure, that infrastructure within like an existing team so that you can achieve those same objectives?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first here if you want. So I think that there's a couple of things when I hear that and when I talk to people about that. And one of the things that I love about my role and everything I've been able to do with the newsletter, with the community, with the conference that I was able to do last year, and pieces like that, is to talk to people about the skills that they can add. And I think that when we think about the skills that we're adding, people tend to get a little like shaky, like, oh, you know, like I've only been a recruiter, I don't know how to do these other things. And that is, I think, maybe some self-talk. Maybe it's some people feeling like, hey, if I start to do it this way, I'm going to feel like an imposter. And the thing that I will tell people is that, like, a lot of the things that I've learned because I've failed at them. And somebody has said, like, hey, actually, this didn't work because of this. And one of the big things in the recruiting operations space is you have to try and you have to fail, and you can't be afraid to fail, because you're going to learn more in those failures than you are in getting it right all the time. And so there are certain things, but there are people out there who will come in and help you. The best formulas that I've ever learned in an Excel doc or a Google sheet were taught to me by people in marketing or people in sales or people in other places. And so it's really the biggest thing that you can do for your recruiting operations career, if you're not sure, is be curious. Touch the buttons, see what happens, create test recs where you're going to be able to delete all the data afterwards so that it doesn't affect your mainline data. But like, do not be afraid to push the button and be curious about something, and then go and talk to the CSM at the company, or go and talk to somebody else in your network and say, like, hey, I pressed this, or I did Y, and it blew up. Now what? Because they'll come back and they'll say, hey, look, I did the same thing too. Or, oh, you know what, actually, don't worry, everything you did was right, but this just happens to be this like small nuanced edge case thing that happens in an ATS. Great case in point, before I hand it off to Brandon. A couple of weeks ago, I was working on a data project with a company. I was deleting profiles that no longer needed to be in their system. Lo and behold, I come to find out that if the candidate has a profile where, let's say, you create a date that you want to create, you want to delete all of the data before that date because you're just like, I don't trust it, it's not reliable, it's not good. I found out that a small nuance to this tool, to this ATS, is I can't just delete those applications. So if you had two applications, one was before that date, one was after that date, I'd have to delete both of them. That's a problem in our space, because it's like, ooh, now I'm going to have a whole bunch of profiles that are sort of sitting out here. So what did I do? I took that information, I went back to the company and I said, hey, look, like, this is a problem. And they went, great, thank you for the feedback. We're going to go back and we're going to fix it. And that's another way. And we talked through all the nuances, and that's how you learn about the tool. So Brandon, back to you.
I love that. Yeah, I think just to like starting with the question again around like the steps to take, like first steps if you want to build a RecOps function from scratch. I don't think the first step is just hire somebody. I think it's like take a step back and do that assessment with your own org, and just see like what is working well, what's not, like what's high priority and is going to make the difference for us. Because you could tweak everything, fine tune every little thing, but like there are going to be some things that you'll see the change immediately, right? That will make a big impact. And then other things you're like making micro adjustments and like gaining efficiencies. But like you'll see pretty apparently like, okay, this is what takes us most of the time, right? And where we're getting into roadblocks. And I'd say more often than not, that's when you're wasting a bunch of time like getting calibrated on a role. Like you're not being intentional from the start and you're just letting people dictate from outside of recruiting how to recruit. They're like, just open the role, start sourcing, bring me profiles. I'll know it when I see it. Like we all know that doesn't work all the time. Often it's really frustrating to do it that way. And then you're in this, like, let's try to anchor on what are we looking for, or you find out in a debrief that somebody's looking for something completely arbitrary that was never spoken. Or I mean, I've had this even happen last year where a hiring manager, like we were like, like a month and a half in on this role, and the manager was like, no, they need to have this experience. I'm like, you've never said that. It's not in the job description. You're like, what are we looking for here? Like, and then I'm like, cool, like now that we know that, and I've been bringing people in that don't have that because you've never said it, here we go again, right? So, things like that, we're like, okay, like structured interviewing is going to probably be a pretty big lift, but it's also going to have a huge impact, right? More than a button switch, right? But there are plenty of things that you can do before you hire an ops person, like that you can do it yourself, whether you're the leader or you want to distribute that amongst your team as like coordinators, sourcers, recruiters. Like you can probably manage the system, you can pull the data, you can do some employer brand and like distribute that amongst yourselves. But there also comes a time where you run out of time, right? Where you don't have the bandwidth because they've added on too many requisitions, and you just like for me, and I know this is like probably common, but like context switching when you have like half an hour blocks throughout the day is really difficult to like pick up right where I left off with this project, right? And it becomes impossible. So like when that is the issue, or is like I have these projects that I need to do, but recruiting is always going to take priority. If we have recs that are open, that's what's always going to take our attention, because we're going to get yelled at, we're going to get fired for it, you name it. But that's going to be what you work on. It's not going to be the process improvement stuff, because you can just recruit, right? You can do it well, you can do it not well, it'll still happen, right? But when you so those just like the fundamental things. But I'd say like the first hire, or like setting it up, is distributed, right? So there's no knock on like a coordinator taking on things or like a recruiter taking on projects, but just know that there's a limiting factor that's going to come up. And when you're going to hire your first one, like I would recommend somebody who's like jack of all trades, very resourceful, genuinely curious, like Jeremy said. That's like, like they can do the systems thing, they can map out process. They're just like really data oriented and detail oriented and are going to figure it out, because you're probably only going to get one headcount to start. You're not going to get like a programs person to run your intern programs, right? And then you're going to get somebody who to do like the career page and branding, right? Like eventually you'll have somebody that's like dedicated to each of those things, and you might even have a team that does employer brand, but like that's way down the road, right? So like somebody like a Jeremy that can do it all is probably a good first hire for RecOps, right?
Yeah.
You're far too kind. I would not say that I can do it all, but to your point, I think it's the resourcefulness to it too. Also within the first hire too, I think sometimes companies feel like they can't get it wrong. And so what they do is they hire a head of talent person to come in and do it. And that head of talent might have been managing people who have been doing that work and not getting their hands dirty. The thing about a RecOps role is you are going to get your hands dirty with things, and it's not like dirty in a bad way, but to also Brandon's point there, like former heads of talent can go in and really talk recruiter to recruiters, which can be a benefit, but real RecOps people come from all over the place and are there about efficiency. So people who are going to get their hands dirty, people who are going to do that is in and out of itself a skill to be looked at as well.
Yeah.
If I can add one more thing on this, because I was in that spot as head of TA, and like they weren't allowing any, additional headcount for ops. Like they were like, you need to hire 5 recruiters. I was like, I know I do. I'll gladly exchange 2 recruiters for 1 ops person. Like that's how valuable it was, because that was my nights and weekends. But there was this expectation that you're the head of TA, figure it out, right? Just do it. You know how to do it. I'm like, I know how to do it, but it's killing me in the process, right? And that's, and I think, there's some, TA leaders here and ops, professionals on the call and recruiters, right? Like you can, like Jeremy said earlier, like you can be good at some of those things. The odds of you being really great at all of the things, pretty low, right? I don't claim that I'm the best at all of it, right? I partner with, I have my colleague Robert, who's a savant at a lot of things. And like we work together so well and we complement each other, and there's some overlap, but like when it comes to like all recruiting ops, like I don't claim to know it all. There's some things that I'm like, I wouldn't even know where to start with that, but he knocks it out of the park, right? So like when you build out an ops function, like just don't have the expectation that you need to be able to do it all as a head of TA, or that like your recruiters or coordinators have to be great at all of it. Like there is a time and place to hire somebody for those things, or like just call out like we need to hire a consultant or a contractor that like is really good at that one thing, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I love that. And I know Jeremy has some resources on his RecOps site as well that talks about, what a RecOps function could look like based on different company sizes and things. But I like the concept of, even as I just stepped into this new role this week, right? I'm coming in, I have a consulting background, so I'm coming in, looking at the process, looking at the tools, looking at those opportunity areas, right? But that's a great place to start, right? And even Talent Collective has some great resources available as well to do an assessment, look at the different functions, look at your tools and technology, look at the process, look at your metrics, look at the people and how they're aligned, right? Recruitment marketing, looking at all those different functions and do an assessment, like how are we doing in this area? And then you can start to figure out, okay, well, where do we want to get to? And then what is the biggest priority? Like, are we having a really issue with candidate experience? Just because like you love technology and want to implement a new ATS, if your ATS is working, that might not be the thing you need to work on, right? Figure out what's going to be the biggest like return on investment that's going to help you get the people that are really going to help you meet your business objectives, right? Like at the end of the day, we hire not just to hire, we hire so that we can support the business in achieving their goals. So I think those are things like there's great resources within Talent Collective that we can use. Jeremy and Brandon can share if they've got other resources that you have that people can leverage. I realize we're like, 20 minutes to go at the end. So I do want to see if we have any questions. I'm having a hard time finding the chat window again, but do we have any questions or things that people want to ask? We can continue. We've got other topics and things to discuss, but we'd love to just pause here and see, does anyone have any questions? You can come off mute or put them in the chat.
I don't know if it's a question as much as it is a statement, in that I feel like RecOps is becoming so important with all of the systems, and especially as we see more and more AI come into focus, and agentic AI specifically, where it takes a little bit of a lift when you're trying to incorporate agentic AI into your environment. And even things like a gem or anything that has that nurture campaign, I don't have time to do that for every role. because I think that talent teams are going to stay really, really lean, where we have to do so much, right? And we don't have time. And so I almost think that if you're building out a new team, or if you get a head count for your team, you should really consider having a RecOps resource come join you and help you, because that's where we're all going to move further faster, is through those system pieces, right? So that's what I'm noticing, and I'm super curious if what you guys are seeing around that piece of it.
Yeah. So Jennifer, it's great that you bring that up. So there's a couple of different angles that I'm seeing in the market. Obviously, we've heard less is more, efficiency, and those pieces. And it boils down to, well, is adding a new person. So when we think about a job description, what we're thinking about is like, oh, this is marketing. Oh, this is going to, we're hiring a person. Isn't this exciting? At a fundamental level, if you're hiring, the real thing is there is a problem that needs to be solved. And the only way for us to solve this problem is to add somebody else to this team. That is at baseline what like a job description is effectively a very big prompt with a question at the end of, can you solve this problem or future problems in this role? Okay, that aside, there are a few angles that I'm starting to see sort of form. One is something that you touch on with this agentic AI push. Present, a lot of those agents are built on your current process and your current data. So really what you can do if you're building in agents to your system is you actually might even want to hire a RecOps type consultant or a RecOps type person to come in, clean everything up, and then help you train your agents on what is your good data, not your bad data, so that everything can go faster in that sort of way. What I'm also starting to see is, to your point, you're seeing smaller and smaller TA teams. There was a post that somebody did a couple of weeks ago where they said, I'm seeing all these recruiter posts come up. Isn't it great? That means there's going to be new or more RC roles coming. Well, that was the old model. Now what we're starting to see is, well, we're not actually going to hire RCs. What we're going to do is we're going to keep the same number of RCs we have, and we'll use a scheduling tool. And that will replace the individual that's coming in, which, going down that route, I think that the death of the RC role or the extinction of the RC role will actually be not great for all of talent acquisition on the whole. That's a whole other conversation, which I'm very happy to have offline. But the other piece that I'm starting to see is that essentially what we're going to probably start to see is you might have one sourcer that almost functions like a BSA, business systems analyst. You'll have a coordinator SME, you'll have a RecOps SME, you'll have your recruiter SME, and those people are going to essentially be covering and managing those agents and working with those agents to make sure that those are optimized. Well, now you have a TA department that's effectively 4 people, 5 people at most. And that's sort of a scary and uncomfortable thought for people. And that's why it sort of pays to learn a lot about agentic AI. But the other pieces on that too is that's one way. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other ways aren't going to happen. And that AI strategy that you're talking about within TA, what you have to kind of determine is it our AI strategy to build a co-pilot, or is our AI strategy to replace? And if your AI strategy is to replace, you're going to be building your TA department very differently, because you're not going to want to invest heavily in enablement, because uncomfortably, you're not going to necessarily want to build people up, because that takes time, that takes effort, and what you want them is to just have the output. Or it's going to be your co-pilot, and building with it as a co-pilot is a very different conversation. You invest time in the enablement. You invest time in making sure that people really understand their tools and the processes, and using RecOps very strategically to be able to help your teams grow. So those are kind of, I know, a bunch of different viewpoints. Some of those, I will admit, I hate saying out loud because it is uncomfortable. But it is a quiet part out loud that I think we as a space need to be talking about, because it means a lot for the recruiting operations verse of things.
Really good point. I'll add on, but I want to reserve more time for questions, because I think that was a really, really thoughtful answer. I'll do like the simplified version of like thinking about RecOps, and the importance in all of this is they're your thought partner, right? Like, is like the, head of TA, who are they chatting with? They might be chatting with a recruiter, it might be, the whole team, things like that. But if you have a RecOps person who like is really like embedded, they know what's going on, like you can dream things together, then you decide on it, and then you do it, right? But if you don't have somebody that has the time to actually implement and get that stuff done, it's just gonna be like, cool, we talked about it, like put it on the dream board, and like someday we'll get to it, right? If you don't have somebody that's dedicated to project work, but they're caught up in recruiting recs, because even if you have one rec, you could spend an infinite amount of time on that position, right? So I'd say like that's the importance, is having somebody on the team that isn't recruiting, like at a very, simplified version, but like they've got the time to go and do the research on these tools and set it up, right? They can vet it for you. Like the head of TA, they don't have any time, right? There's no time to spare as a head of TA. I don't care like how busy you are, you're wrapped up in meetings, you have your own rec load, like you're doing the system stuff, like somebody wants a report, like your time is toast. So that's where I think RecOps is very important, because your coordinator is going to have stuff to do, your sources are going to have stuff to do, your recruiters are going to have stuff to do, that it's going to drop. They're going to drop the ball on it.
Yeah, and I think something that I'll just layer on to what Jeremy was saying too is like kind of that RC role, that coordinator role might be, going away a bit. But I look at like just the evolution of people that I've had on my team that started as RCs, and not all of them wanted to become recruiters, right? But they liked the operations side. So even though, at the time we didn't call it that, we morphed those people into recruiting operations specialists and gave them like all the special projects, right? So, there's ways that you can do that. And the reality is there's a lot of recruiters that just want to recruit. Like they don't want to do this stuff. So even if you say to them like, hey, I need you to like take this recruitment marketing project, or you're going to do this, like that might not be what they want to do, right? So I think it's also looking at the team that you have available. What are people's skill sets? What are they interested in? Where do they want to grow and develop? And then between that, figuring it out. And it might be like looking at, partnering with someone like Brandon and his company, or, leveraging resources like Jeremy to say, hey, what should I be doing to actually move the needle on this with like the skill set that I have today, or the budget that I have today?
Well, to build on your point too, just super, super quick there, like my first TA jobs for like essentially a whole bunch of my roles were like, hey, we're not really sure. We're not really sure of the title yet, because titling is still something that's been out there. But we're going to call you basically a recruiting specialist or recruiting coordinator, but you're going to be focusing on the ops side. And so that conversation has actually made it a lot harder, at least now, because people are like, well, you were an RC, and there's this perception of what the RC was. But to your point, I didn't want to recruit. I didn't like the idea of cold calling people. And that skill has actually changed much more, because at least as far as tech recruiting goes, you're not really cold calling candidates much anymore to get their attention. So that's something that industry-wide has changed, and changed, I think, for the better, because that, I think, at least initially scared me when I was just like, hey, I like the space. I just want to find something that keeps me in it.
Yeah.
So that's something else to kind of think about.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, what other questions do we have? We've got about 8 minutes left. Would love to hear any comments. And thanks, Jennifer, for chiming in with your perspective. But anyone else? Let's see. Looks like there might be some in here. Sorry. Okay. Tessa said, I personally have spent a good amount of time lately making sure the tools we are currently using, we are using them to the best of our ability, especially with updates that ATS and partners are releasing this year, AI, increased scheduling functions, etc. Yeah. definitely that is something that, you know, a lot of companies don't even do. They're not keeping on top of what the ATS is rolling out to even know that there's these tools available or function. So that is definitely a good one. Okay, anything else? What other questions do we have? Anything?
I would also just quickly throw this out there too. One of the key question words in recruiting operations too is why. And there's an activity, especially when you're doing first principles thinking, that's called the 5 whys. And it's not strictly capped to 5 whys, but you're essentially using that question to keep going back, and back. And usually, like Brandon just mentioned in the chat, like when you're dealing with people who are frustrated at their ATS, that can be so many different why type questions. It's like, why are you frustrated at the ATS? Well, it doesn't do the thing we wanted to do. Well, is that because you're trying to ask the process to do something different than what it's programmed to do? Or is it because you don't understand? And so it's using those why questions to grow will help you grow your career. It's not the obnoxious why, but it will tell you so much about how people are looking at their tools, how they're thinking about their tools. How do you then design to optimize? Because if, for example, it's a problem with your ATS and making sure that you're maximizing it, well, you have to teach people how to maximize it, especially if they're not curious. Because you can't just sort of, I think on the RecOps side, we overestimate sometimes how much the recruiting side and our recruiting partners are curious, because we have to be curious every day.
So what are, like, if, you know, we're wrapping up, if there's questions, feel free to share them, but like what, you know, trends or innovations in RecOps like excite you guys the most as we kind of think about what's coming next, right? There's so much talk about AI and whatnot, but like, what are some of the things that like you feel are really like cutting edge that this team needs to be mindful of as we kind of look to, you know, operate in our functions or look at building out RecOps functions or teams? What are you excited about?
I've got 2 that I am really, really excited about. So I'll just say like the names first and then dive into them, but BrightHire and then Covey. And like there are other tools that do these same things, but BrightHire is essentially what Gong does for sales. They do it for recruiting. So it's record, transcribe, and optimize your recruiting funnel, right? So you can actually see what happened during these interviews and know, you know, with more confidence what actually happened. You can make better decisions. You can use it as a training tool as well. But it also has an AI layer that actually does all the intake stuff that, you know, we've tried to, you know, we've actually built it with AI and like it works, but they've built it into their tool where you're like, I want to open a job. Cool, here's a job description. I want to, you know, build out an interview plan. Boom, here's your interview plan, right? Like the things that took probably at least a week to like wrangle your hiring manager to like sit down and let's talk it through is now done in seconds. So that's really rad. But I think more than anything, like as long as we are still like having face-to-face interactions with people, you know, recording an interview and having an interview still makes sense. And like, I think there's still a time and place for that in this world. And that's a really exciting technology in my opinion. And then Covey is just AI sourcing. Like they were a Gem, I mean, they're still a Gem competitor, but they were like, cool, we do what Gem does, but now we're like, you know, going forward to like an AI sourcer. Then there will be plenty of technologies that do this and probably do it just as well or better. But that was like the first time I've used one, and I was like, this is better than I expected, better than I would do it. Right? It took like once I set it up on a job, I didn't have to source another minute on that job, and I just had candidates rolling in, none the wiser. That like they wanted to talk to me and they're like, oh, thank you so much for reaching out. Like this sounds like a really cool opportunity. Here's my, you know, like I'm jumping on your calendar. And I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't have to go to LinkedIn. And like as a, you know, like as a recruiter or a sourcer, like it just takes forever to source, you know, and it's endless. And if you can just have something that's like got the human nuance where they like test the parameters of what like who would your hiring manager actually talk to versus what they're telling you, and it has that level of specificity, and then you can just like tweak it to you're like, hey, like this funnel's filled with only men, can we fix that? Yes, we can. And the next day you have like, you know, very balanced, or like even like, you know, augmenting it the other direction. You know, like so you can like have those types of abilities, you know, using tech where you don't have to have a human spending countless hours and like burning their eyeballs looking at a screen.
Awesome.
So that's what I'm excited about.
Well, those are tools that we can add to our Tool Talk Tuesday. We can think about for the future. So thank you. We do another call talking about that. So we'll keep those in mind. I know we have like 3 minutes left. Jeremy, you want to share your top things we're interested in or what you're excited about?
I think that there's a lot out there that I'm really excited about, especially with like what people are building, at least in our space, around being able to generate reports using native language. I think that saves me a ton of time when somebody is like, hey, I want to know this element. I think the biggest caution that I would throw out there, and Covey is great about this, I've had conversations with their leadership team too around it, is when you are using a tool, make sure that everybody understands the pieces that they're going to anchor on that might not be correct. So for example, I know for a fact Covey and a lot of these resume scanning tools and things like that flag for job hoppers. Well, the problem is that for many of these tools, they didn't attach that thing out to anything. And so they have no context. And we also have to remember that hiring managers, you know, tend to be very forward thinking. They don't tend to look back very much. So for them, 2020 layoffs, 2022 layoffs are in the past. And it's entirely possible that there are very human things where you just picked the wrong horse and got stuck in a bad situation. And unfortunately, that's something that people will look and say, oh, well, I don't want any job hoppers. And they'll look at like maybe short stints and say, oh, well, they were a job hopper. It's like, well, no, they got laid off. That's not on them. So if you like what you see, let's have the conversation. But any AI tool that you're going to use that's going to filter people, make sure that you are auditing it, make sure that you are working to train it so that it doesn't automatically just sort of broadly sweep people into a certain group where you haven't done an explanation for people to understand that, like, you can't just have people just anchor on these things.
Great point. Well, this has been a great discussion. I know I have found it invaluable. So thank you both, Brandon and Jeremy. Any other parting words? I know we're right at 1 o'clock. Anyone, Jeremy and Brandon, I can share with the team links to your sites and your information if anyone wants to get to connect with you both. I saw you put your LinkedIn profiles in there so people can connect with you too. But really thankful for you spending your hour with us today and sharing all your wisdom, and excited to see people can take these tips and tricks and everything and apply them in their space today. So hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon and Jeremy. Bye, guys.
Absolutely.
See you guys at Talent Sphere.
Yes.
Bye, you guys.
Thanks so much.